Okay, everybody, what we're going to do right now is continue on what we were talking about with the presidencies. So we're going to look at some each individual presidents, and we're going to kind of go through a couple pretty quickly. And then once we get to Clinton, Bush, and Obama, we'll slow down a little bit. But, coming out of the assassination of Kennedy, LBJ took over. And one of the goals that LBJ had was to continue the civil rights push that uh, JFK really was in favor of for. He also implemented something called the Great Society, and we'll talk about that. And then, we started to see the more violent aspects of the Vietnam War coming up. So, one of Johnson's first actions was to appoint Chief Justice Earl Warren as the head investigator in the Kennedy assassination. So, we if we were in class right now, physically we would be doing a lot of kind of investigation into this, but due to time constraints, we're really not going to get that deep into a rabbit hole about the Kennedy assassination. I've made it known in previous classes that we've met that I think it was a conspiracy and that there was one shooter. But what the Warren Commission found was that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone shooter, right? One of the things that LBJ really tried to do was to kind of continue the legacy of Kennedy, and that was the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Right now, the Supreme Court is deciding, it should be deciding whether or not sexual orientation is going to be placed on that list as well. It prohibits unequal applications of voter registration requirements, racial segregations in schools, employment, and public accommodations. And coming out of Brown versus Board of Education, which was in 1955, it still took kind of a good 9 years for a lot of these things to be implemented. A lot of these bans to be implemented, bans on segregation, bans on Jim Crow laws. And like I always kept telling you guys, what good is a law if there's nobody to enforce it? And right now we're starting to see the federal government, along with state governments, finally starting to enforce these laws. LBJ also instituted something called the Great Society, which basically was a war on poverty. Established programs such as Head Start, which provided preschool education for children in lower income areas. Now Head Start could be used for any child. He also instituted something called Medicare, which is socialized medicine for us when we turn 65. Medicaid, which is state-sponsored socialized medicine. So if you meet a certain requirement here in California, you can get on what's called Medi-Cal and you'll have health insurance. Kind of used as a safety net. Now we started to see also kind of a more violent view of the Vietnam War because one of the classic pictures or the classic videos is of Dan Rather, who is an old school newsman, reporting from Vietnam, and behind them soldiers are being taken out in body bags. So, finally we're starting to see a real seriousness to war that we never really saw on film or on television. So that's one of the things that kind of really started to have people, look at the Vietnam War in a little bit more scrutiny. Congress had passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964. It actually granted Johnson the power to use military force in South Vietnam or in Southeast Asia. But there was no declaration of war. And as we started to see numbers of military personnel increase. We saw, and as you can see the numbers, originally 16,000 advisors in non-combat roles in 1963, all the way up to 525,000 in combat roles. And American casualties soared, and the peace process waned a bit. And as we know, again, this is a lot of things that were occurring where we started to see anti-war movements growing, especially on university campuses. It's where you started to see, the use of the word hippies and the people who are anti-war, pro-love, pro-peace. South Vietnam also went into chaos after Diem's assassination. So LBJ decided not to rerun for president. Nixon became president. Some of the things that were occurred during his administration were continuation of the Vietnam War, an opening of relationships with China again, and also Watergate, and eventually his resignation. He was president from 68 to 74, right? Nixon in the 1968 elections basically said he had a plan to end the war in Vietnam, but it took 5 years from that point to totally disengage the U.S. from Vietnam. And remember, the whole concept of being in Vietnam was trying to stem and trying to contain the spread of communism. Remember that domino theory that we talked about when we talked about Korea. One area falls to communism, and subsequently other areas will fall to communism. About a third of the Americans who died in combat during the Vietnam War died during the Nixon presidency. He also tried to practice something. This is a term I want you guys to be able to understand and be able to tell me about, is the concept of Vietnamization. And that was kind of putting the onus on the South Vietnamese government to bear the brunt of the ground fighting as opposed to American soldiers, right? This whole idea was, let's let these people fight these wars for us and have them, in a sense, be the ones more in harm's way as opposed to the U.S. Soldiers. Also, there were some bloody battles that went into Cambodia and into Laos. So, kind of out of that, we started to see an incursion into Cambodia, which destabilized the area, which provoked a bloody civil war, bringing to power the murderous Khmer Rouge, which was led by a guy named Pol Pot, who practiced ethnic cleansing and genocide. And, very strong dictatorship communist group in that area. As a result, Nixon also started to reduce the numbers of U.S. troops in Vietnam from 549,000 to 69,000 as a part of this Vietnamization strategy. Nixon was eventually attempted to negotiate a peace treaty with the North Vietnamese leader. Under the terms, the U.S. had agreed to withdraw the troops within 60 days in exchange for a ceasefire and returning American prisoners of war, and North Vietnam's promise to recognize the legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government. Nixon also opened up avenues to China, right? And China had fallen into communism, and he tried to improve relationships with China. Both sides had agreed to articulate their differences and kind of make a progress toward normalcy. The most significant development in this was on the issue of Taiwan, affirming that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China, and that a peace be settled by the Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait. Now, the thing that brought down Nixon's presidency, obviously, was Watergate. So what was Watergate? Simply, Watergate was the name of a hotel. I think it still exists there in D.C. And at that time, in that hotel, the Democratic National Committee had their offices there. So actually, a group of guys known as the Committee to Re-elect the President, or known as CREEP, that's what they called themselves, broke into the Watergate Hotel, the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate Hotel, and stole some of their top secret documents and bugged the office phones. At one time, the wiretaps did not work, so they went back in to try to fix them, and at that time, a security guard caught them. It later came to light that Nixon wasn't being truthful and that he wasn't saying he wasn't aware of the break-in, but he had arranged to provide thousands of dollars in hush money to these burglars. And also, as part of kind of his incessant paranoia, Nixon used to record every conversation in the Oval Office, and he was compelled to turn over a conversation he was having with regards to Watergate. He claimed executive privilege. When that didn't work, he was compelled to turn over some tapes and 17 minutes of a particular discussion were accidentally, and look at the accidentally in quotation marks, air quotes, right? Accidentally erased by his secretary. Now, one thing that led to that was his resignation and subsequently the appointment of Gerald Ford as president. Now, Gerald Ford was not vice president for a great part of Nixon's presidency. It was a gentleman named Spiro Agnew who was the vice president, who actually had some tax issues and had to resign the presidency. As a result of his the vice presidency. As a result of his resignation, Gerald Ford was appointed to be vice president. So when Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became president. So this is a pretty good trivia answer here. So somebody asks you, who was the only president in current times to have not been elected? The answer is Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was appointed president and vice president and never went through an election for either. His 895-day-long presidency is the shortest in U.S. history for any president who didn't die in office. At that time, Gerald Ford was a House of Representative member from the state of Michigan. When he was appointed to be the VP, he pardoned Nixon, and then Nixon was forgiven for any crimes that he may have committed and any potential crimes that he may have committed. After that, we started to see the presidency of Jimmy Carter, and a couple of things that we saw out of that were Iran, a lot of inflation, and the Camp David Accords, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. I don't know if you've seen the first maybe 10 minutes of Argo, the movie with Ben Affleck that talks about the revolution of Iranian students that took over as far as a revolution and tried to kind of put Iran, which was a democratic government, into a government ran by Sharia law. The Shah, who was a pro-Western autocrat, had been expelled from his country some months before to come to the United States for cancer treatment. Many Iranians were fed up with the Shah. There were some aspects of kleptocracy or government stealing from the people, high amounts of poverty, and at this time, the revolutionaries overthrew the Shah of Iran and disbanded his government, and he fled to Egypt. A couple of things that happened was during the Iranian Revolution, a group of students overtook the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, and held many embassy workers hostage in Tehran during that time. They were in captivity for up to over 600 days. And, kind of the intense media coverage of this hostage crisis really didn't do any favors to Jimmy Carter, as it made him look like a weak and ineffective leader. They were eventually released, but it was soon after Reagan was inaugurated, and a lot of people gave Reagan the credit for that. And I think I said 600 days, but these people were in captivity or kidnapped or sequestered for 444 days, and they were all American citizens working in the U.S. embassies. During Carter's presidency, one of the things that he faced was the rising inflation. And, as we know, inflation is the cost of goods and services going up, right? So if our cost of living is not going up, but prices are going up, we're in a bad state. And we saw inflation rise to about 12%. I think a good inflation is considered to be about 3%. So if prices rise about 3%, that's probably what's expected. But if it's at 12%, imagine, having a gallon of milk that costs $1. Inflation would say that, a good set of inflation would be, it would then go up to $1.03. But bad instance would be if it went up to $1.12. So just kind of knowing the numbers, and $1 is simple and $1 is easy to calculate, can see how much, when we have high priced goods and services, if a 12% increase on prices goes up, that's not a good thing. Carter had tried to eliminate federal deficits, but by 1980 we were at a $60 billion deficit, which is kind of peanuts to what we have now. And at that time, we also had an energy crisis and an oil shortage. Carter was also enabled to negotiate the Camp David Accords. It was a peace treaty between the Israelis and the Egyptians, which within 3 months, it called for Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula to complete it within 3 years. And it called for further meetings to resolve the Palestinian question. And as we know, that Palestinian question has still not been answered yet. And what I'm talking about is kind of if Palestine would be considered their own functioning government. And I know this is a very difficult thing to try to explain and try to understand. But what I, kind of take, what you guys are taking from this is this Israeli-Palestinian type conflict has been going on for years, and I don't think it is a situation that's going to end anytime soon. Okay, this led to Reagan. Reagan was a two-term president. Reaganomics were a big part of his platform, ending the Cold War with the Soviet Union. I like to say that him and Bill Clinton are what are known as Teflon presidents, and that's a term that I stole from other people when they talk about them, and the Iran-Contra scandal. What I mean by a Teflon president is that a Teflon president can have all these big bad things that happen to them, and he still remains popular, right? So let's look at some of the things that Reagan did. Reagan really believed in kind of that strong, conservative theory where we have small government, low taxes, reduce regulations, and prevent inflation. Reagan practiced something called supply-side economics, which meant that in order for the country to do well, in his opinion, you need to cut taxes on the wealthy. Then, it's kind of that what we talked about when we talked about classic liberalism. Then that money's going to trickle down to the people at the lower earners levels, and they can use that to spend money on personal property, which stimulates the economy. Now, you're kind of looking at this really optimistically. If you think about business owners, if they are saving money, are they going to use it to reinvest in their business? Or are they going to save it, which is something you don't really want them to do, because then the money's not getting stimulated in the economy. Reagan's whole thought was that, by reducing numbers, it would cut into the deficit, but in a sense, he increased the deficit because when he cut taxes, he didn't cut spending, and we saw an increase in military spending in an attempt to end the Cold War, which saw, our deficits grow to an unprecedented level. He did help end the Cold War. Reagan, along with Mikhail Gorbachev, who were kind of kindred spirits in a way, and were able to effectively end the Cold War do something called perestroika, or family or friendliness type stuff. Glasnost, that's another term that was used. Signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that took out nuclear and conventional missiles, as well as their launchers in certain areas. We also went as far as to tear down the Berlin Wall, which was kind of the symbol of communism versus freedom, right? Good versus bad, good versus evil. And this ended the Cold War. Okay, so we'll look a little bit more about Reagan's Iran-Contra hearing things when we talk about the 80s. But let's go to George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush was president after Reagan. He was the vice president during the Reagan administration. We saw the first Persian Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The United States had threatened that if they didn't withdraw, they would take military action. This led to Operation Desert Storm. And in 1991, the coalition forces prepared to face off against Iraq, numbered from 750,000, including over 540,000 U.S. troops. They led a massive airstrike against Iraqis' air defenses, dropping bombs, using stealth bombers, cruise missiles. And by February 28th, the Persian Gulf War ended and Kuwait was liberated. Only 300, I still don't like to say only 300 coalition troops or allied troops were killed in that war. After that, we had a recession, right? We started to see, crashing of the housing market, which will happen again under another Bush's watch, which actually kind of led to the election of Bill Clinton, right? So Bill Clinton, we saw economic prosperity, we saw a surplus, but then ultimately we saw scandal, which was prevalent during the during the Clinton administration. We had strong economic growth. Clinton did the opposite of what Reagan did. Clinton raised taxes on the wealthy and cut defense spending, which gave us our first surplus in years. Establishing fiscal discipline, eliminating the budget deficit, maintaining low interest rates, and encouraging the private sector to invest in human capital, invest in people through education and research. Also passed something called welfare reform, where he was kind of this happened in 1996, and he was kind of catering a bit to maybe centrist Republicans, where he made it where you tried to get somebody to be only on welfare or public assistance for up to 5 years, put that 5-year limit in, and during that time, these people would need to either be going to school, taking care of somebody's kid, learning a trade, or whatever. So this isn't technically a democratic ideology type method, but I think it was more of Clinton trying to appeal to the more moderate Republicans to win re-election in 1996. So Clinton was kind of marred with scandals and extended to his wife later in history. First, he had a Whitewater, which was a failed real estate investment. During his term as governor of Arkansas, he pressured businessman David Hale to make a $300,000 loan to somebody named Susan McDougal. They were to purchase 220 acres of land in the Ozarks up in Arkansas. That would be the Whitewater Development Corporation. It failed, and the Clintons lost about $40,000, which is like probably you and me losing $40 now, right? It'll bother me, but I'm not going to lose sleep over it. In 3 inquiries into the Whitewater deal, there was no evidence to charge the Clintons with criminal conduct. However, he was caught red-handed as far as an affair with Miss Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky was a White House intern who had an alleged sexual tryst with the president. Prior to his election as president, Clinton was involved in a sexual harassment case that was brought to him by a lady named Paula Jones when he was governor of Arkansas. During this whole Paula Jones incident, Linda Tripp was a friend of Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky had worked as an intern and a DOD employee in the White House. During kind of a conversation over the phone, Lewinsky divulged that she had a sexual relationship with the president, and Linda Tripp had been recording it, which a lot of people tend to forget that is illegal. And I think Linda Tripp did do have some criminal charges brought against her for that. So in the case, when they asked Clinton, was he telling the truth? When they asked him what is his, response to the fact, or the question asked during the deposition on whether or not he had sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky. This is what he said, and you could probably find the video, but it's I think it's a little bit funnier to read it out loud. His answer was, it depends on what the word is. If is means is and never has been, that is one thing. If it means there is none, that was a completely true statement. Now, if somebody had asked me on that day, are you having any kind of sexual relations with Mr. Lewinsky? That is, ask me a question in the present tense, I would have said no, and it would have been completely true. So he's kind of maybe trying to BS his way out of this a little bit. That would be my impression of this. Got red-handed, right? Clinton admitted that he later had he later admitted he was wrong and had an appropriate relationship with Lewinsky, and this came out after Lewinsky had some proof of that for, you know, to be a little bit more, what's the word I want to use? A little bit more politically correct. If you want to look at the proof, what was, the absolute thing that proved that he was having a relationship with Lewinsky, you can always Google it. And it involved a dress, so I'm not going to go too in-depth in that. As a result of his charge with he was charged with perjury, which is basically lying under oath. Articles of impeachment were drawn up, and it was really similar to what we saw back in earlier this year with Trump, where the House of Representatives voted to impeach, but then when it went to the Senate voted not to convict. And it was more than $70 million spent on the investigation. And ironically, Ken Starr was the head of the investigation. He was Trump's primary defense attorney during his impeachment hearing. So it's an interesting thing. Now we have George W. Bush, right? His defining moment was probably 9/11. His public approval rating soared to 1990. I always remember where, we were really a divided country coming out of the 2000 election, which we saw in that video before we were told to not meet in person anymore. He had a lot of kind of issues with regards to his legitimacy. But after 9/11 happened and some of the response to 9/11, his approval rating soared to 90% because we were a very unified people. Also, we had things that happened such as the Bush tax cuts, education reform, which was No Child Left Behind, which we talked a little bit about. So tweaks to healthcare, the U.S. Patriot Act, which we're going to get into in a little bit. And obviously that's going to be the next kind of thing we're going to look at when we talk about the U.S. and its response to some foreign policies or its look at foreign policies. We had the two wars in Iraq. The original, Operation Iraqi Freedom was the attempt to eliminate Iraqis' weapons of mass destruction and enact a regime change. So, as a result of this, the UN had given Saddam Hussein a certain amount of time to let UN inspectors into Iraq to search for weapons of mass destruction. He never complied with UN resolutions, and therefore coalition troops decided to enact a surge of combat troops and engage local leaders and went into Iraq and never found weapons of mass destruction. We have the housing crisis where the housing bubble burst. Houses became worthless after mortgage-backed securities lost value and the stock market dropped. This led to TARP, which was a bailing out of the banks, much like what we've been seeing in the past couple of weeks. This housing crisis, again, this is one of the things that if we were in class, maybe we could take about 15 to 20 minutes to really, really explain the housing crisis. I mean, I'm not going to be able to give you 100% accurate view of it. But if you want to watch an interesting documentary about it, there's a movie called The Inside Job. And that goes over the financial crisis, and it looks at how some of these banks were, in a sense, rating mortgages and mortgage companies as sound investments when they were really not. And that's A whole other thing that I really wish we could get into, but for lack of time, we're gonna have to just kind of understand that some of this went through the Bush's administration. Now, we talked about retrospective voting, and I think that's really what led to Obama's um, election in 2008. Ran against John McCain. Obama was a Harvard-trained lawyer, taught con law at the University of Chicago. 2004 became a U.S. senator. Then in 2008 became the president with 53% of the popular vote. If we look at some of his domestic record, economic stimulus bill, which actually started with Bush, but kind of continued through Clinton. Obamacare, which is known as the Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act, which required states to get into relationships with insurance companies, trying to make them provide insurance for people who didn't get it through a job or didn't get it through other means, and to make it affordable. If we talk about his foreign policy record, obviously his probably biggest foreign policy victory was the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011. Okay, so that's what we got for the modern presidents right now.